several times before. It's great to have you back, Stephen. Thank you for taking the time to be here again.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, as usual, we started chatting behind the scenes and it got fun and exciting. And I was like, no, hold on. This is golden material. We have to hit the record button. But now I'm trying to figure out how best to resituate the conversation to make the magic happen again. I guess in short, you've been doing a fair amount of thinking in philosophy of religion and worldview debates, and specifically theism and naturalism. And you've been thinking about the moral realm, right? And not just, the notion that there are moral facts. Obviously, I think we're kind of operating from a moral realism here, but also how we account for moral knowledge and stuff like that. So I wanted to explore that with you in today's conversation. So let me just now punt it your way and allow you to do any sort of initial background or stage setting you think is important before we start diving into the details.
No, thanks. It was it's great always to talk to you, and hopefully your listeners get something out of this. I tried to prepare some notes because some people might be listening on the highway. So I want to be as clear and to the point as possible, but this is a complicated issue. And I actually kind of was thinking about this as kind of a follow-up to our last conversation when we talked about naturalism and reliability.
Right.
But anyway, so I guess one way to introduce the point is that I've been thinking about the question of what we can expect given unguided evolutionary processes. By that I mean that the evolutionary processes are unguided by any kind of God, or there's no theism being assumed here. Some philosophers typically phrase this as evolution plus naturalism, right? And I've been thinking about, well, what can we expect given, just assume for the moment, given unguided evolutionary mechanisms with respect to producing cognitive faculties that are able to apprehend moral truths, right? So right away, I want to make a distinction between moral realism, which is the thesis that there are moral truths, and moral knowledge or moral skepticism, which is claims or discussions about our ability to apprehend those truths. And I want to focus on the latter. I want to focus on what we can expect of unguided evolutionary mechanisms with respect to whether those mechanisms or processes would produce cognitive faculties that dispose us to apprehend moral truths.
Yes. And so we are going to sort of assume a background of moral realism for this conversation then?
Yeah, and I don't think that's a particularly difficult assumption, because I think the upshot that I want to make, hopefully in a few minutes, is that the evidential argument from evil has to assume a robust moral realism.
Right? Oh, well, that sounds like an interesting thesis that I'm excited to explore. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is this sense in which the principal arguments against theism, the hiddenness argument, and in particular the evidential argument from evil, require this assumption that there are things that ought never to be done.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. I'm excited to explore that with you as well. Obviously, that's something people have put a lot of thought into, and what I love about our conversations with together, Stephen, also reading your work, is you always have a very novel and interesting way of thinking about things. I really enjoyed your stuff on hiddenness in general, for example.
Thanks.
I really mean it. So I guess if you're just a dedicated moral anti-realist just for independent reasons, this probably isn't the conversation for you, but you might find it interesting anyways. But I don't think I'm a committed moral realist. I think it seems to me, again, I mean, the latest surveys I've seen, and just in general talking to people, theists and atheists alike, the clear majority, it seems to me, are moral realists. Now you do a lot more work in the relevant circles than I do. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, I mean, my principal area of concentration as an academic is in bioethics, and most bioethicists, I mean, in a way, our career depends on there being a right answer, right?
Yeah, certainly, right.
There's a right answer. There's really no use to, or it undercuts the importance of doing any kind of thinking and publishing on these matters. So I find that the profession, at least among practical bioethicists or practical ethicists, period, is typically they're okay with moral realism. Yeah.
Right. Cool. Well, maybe at some point we'll come back and do a wider meta-ethical thing. But I think most people, I think again, most of the atheists I read, right, the more interesting, sophisticated ones are themselves moral realists, and they try to give some sort of account for that. So I think we're on pretty safe ground here. So yeah, please continue, Stephen. Where do we go from here? Yep.
Yeah. So I guess the overarching point, and I mentioned this in I think I mentioned this quotation in the previous podcast, but I think it's a nice way to start and get the basic idea of where we're going. Darwin himself says, and this is referred to as Darwin's doubt. He says, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" Right. And so that's kind of getting at this idea that, well, if you just look at the evolutionary processes from the perspective of assuming naturalism, these processes go along. Do you have any reason for thinking that they are reliable? So you might have a reason for thinking that our early hominid ancestors formed beliefs. What we want to know is whether they formed cognitive faculties that are, for the most part, reliable. Right. Again, given only this idea that evolutionary processes only care about survival. Right. Patricia Churchland, she says something similar, much more recently than Darwin. She says, "The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive."
Yeah.
Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes hindmost. Okay, so that's the basic idea, is that evolutionary processes are really only concerned about survival. And I want to, Evan Plantinga and a few others want to kind of expand and say, well, this applies to all of our cognitive faculties, and we discussed this last time. I want to focus on the ability to apprehend moral truths, right?
Yeah.
Given these initial doubts. And specifically, I want to focus on the aspect of some of our moral judgments that philosophers refer to as their deontic quality. And by that is meant simply, there are certain moral judgments to the effect that certain actions ought never to be done.
Right.
They're intrinsically evil. Or certain actions must be done. The lifeguard who, somebody's drowning 50 feet offshore, easily savable, at least for the lifeguard. Saving that person must be done. Right.
Right.
And this is ought. Yeah. The quality I want to get. Now, I want to emphasize that because someone might immediately say, well, why isn't just the judgment, the lifeguard, it would be good for the lifeguard to go save. Sure. Okay.
Hold on. See, if you wouldn't mind, could you just
never to torture someone for.
Could you just rewind the tape about 10 seconds, Stephen?
Yeah.
Sorry, you were breaking up there a little bit, but I think you made an important point that I just want to make sure is reiterated.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. All right. I'm landline in. I don't know why it broke up.
That's okay. It's back now. Yep.
Yeah. The idea is. Oh, it is back. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So one way to get at this, what's so significant about this idea of the deontic quality of our moral judgments is to see what the problem looks like in another more tangible sphere, right? And here I'm kind of borrowing some reflections of Crawford Elder. And he says, just what evidence apprises us that chromium necessarily has an atomic number of 24, that quartz crystals by nature have their molecules arranged in certain sort of lattice, and that lightning is essentially or necessarily an electrical phenomenon, right? So Elder is asking, okay, well, what's going to cue us into the essential, necessary aspects of certain things? Mm-hmm. And he wants to immediately say, well, look, our knowledge of these facts cannot be a function of uniformity, right? We see them occurring all the time alongside each other. And he illustrates why that can't be the answer. Very interesting. He says, suppose we found chromium only in Zimbabwe, right? That all and only chromium, and this might be true for certain types of diamonds, mm-hmm. right? Suppose we all and only artifacts of chromium were found in Zimbabwe. It still wouldn't make chromium essentially, mined from Zimbabwe, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's not what it is. It's a metal, right? So even if there is a uniformity, uniformities still don't indicate or tell us what the nature of the substance is, mm-hmm. right? What it is essentially. Michael Ray, he gets at this in a very interesting series of reflections. I'll just quote it. So long as one gets the relevant regularities right, from the fitness point of view, it seems wholly irrelevant. One also happens to believe that some of the regularities are also necessities, mm-hmm. right? So again, if we just focus on this idea of uniformity, that's all that's required for survival. We don't need to go the extra step and understand chromium is essentially atomic number 24, mm-hmm. right? Even if it were mined from only one and only place. Ray continues, similarly, believing mathematical falsehoods, logical falsehoods, and conceptual falsehoods might result in failure to survive and reproduce, but how could there be any evolutionary advantage associated with having true beliefs about the modal status? This is what logicians refer to as necessity and contingency. Mm-hmm. The modal status of these propositions, and this is the key point that I want to get at. Okay, mm-hmm. So long as one believes that 2 + 2 = 4 will always be true, it does not seem to matter whether one also believes that it is necessarily true.
Yeah, an important but subtle distinction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that's why I want to focus attention on this idea of the deontic quality of certain moral judgments, right? Because most evolutionary explanations of moral judgments will focus on this idea, well, so long as the beliefs are always there, right? Survival is good. Mm-hmm. That's all that's required. But our moral faculties are kind of tuned into this deontic quality, and of certain moral judgments, and we have no reason for thinking on unguided evolutionary mechanisms that we would be so attuned, right? We wouldn't be attuned to that deontic, that ought,
right?
Of certain moral judgments.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to highlight here that this is really important, because when it comes to, I think, comparing, large scale theories of everything, right? Like theism or naturalism, and we're trying to kind of zero in on an explanatory target, it is important to understand all the aspects of that explanatory target. Mm-hmm. And our moral experience is very, very rich, right? It's not just that, we think we need to account for moral truths, right? That it is true that it is, always and everywhere wrong to torture a small child for $10 or something like that, right? But also our apprehension of those truths, the moral knowledge. But you're going even deeper, right? Our apprehension of the necessity of that, and that again, I just don't want that to be missed of what you're zeroing in on, because I, like you, agree, like this is something that needs to be accounted for, and if a theory cannot account for that, then that's a cost. It's a cost to some degree. I think an actually pretty significant one. I don't know if there's anything else you want to emphasize about it, but I, again, want to just kind of show, like, yes, this is subtle, but it's significant. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of maybe as people are driving, it might be okay, these quotations. Okay, well, these quotations, and I'm kind of highlighting this distinction here. And again, you brought it out. So there's this very important aspect of our moral judgments, certain moral judgments, to the effect that we're able to apprehend its ought quality, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. Its must quality, mm-hmm. right? It's not just that we always make that judgment. It's not just, as you said, it's always and everywhere wrong. It's that it must be wrong, mm-hmm. right? Or we must do this action. It must be right. Mm-hmm. Well, okay. All right. So what I want to just basically claim is that given unguided evolutionary mechanisms, I don't see how unguided evolutionary mechanisms can explain the formation of cognitive faculties that dispose us to apprehend that quality of our moral judgments, right? Or that quality of the moral reality. Mm-hmm. There are explanations of the sort, most naturalistic explanations for morality focus on this idea that, well, survival is good, and the formation of our moral judgments is kind of conceptually related to survival. So, for example, if survival is good, that would explain how we form moral judgments that cooperation is good, or that peace is good, right? Because fighting with the other tribes is not conducive. One might say is not conducive to survival. Okay, so I want to spend a little time on that explanation because it crops up so much. Somebody can say, look, why wouldn't we form moral judgments when our survival is kind of related to cooperating with others well, right? Mm-hmm. And the first point to make is that almost the entire animal kingdom is a counterexample to that.
Yeah, right, right.
Right. Uh-huh. So monkeys, macaque monkeys, or any kind of gorillas or any kind of packed animal.
Various forms of forced copulation in the animal.
Yeah, all of it, right? They survive quite well by fighting with other tribes. And actually, it's kind of puzzling to me why this explanation might be found initially plausible, because it's being, it usually is given with full knowledge that there are limited resources. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it actually is conducive to the survival of a tribe to fight for those resources. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So cooperation is not the moral judgment we would expect that would follow given unguided evolutionary mechanisms plus limited resources, which is reality. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. And we have no reason for thinking, this is also key, that given the survival explanation, that the members of the tribe would think that the survival of others is good. Mm. It only explains why we might form the judgment that the survival of members of my own tribe or family are good. Mm-hmm. And then I think a deeper problem with this explanation, well, there are two related problems. And that is, it misses out, right, this idea of survival being good. Okay, that's all fine and good, but it leaves out several judgments that we would expect or need explaining. For example, it leaves out the judgment that others are rights holders, right? I might judge that their survival is good, but not judge that they are a right holder. Mm. What are rights, right? Especially on a naturalistic worldview, right? I don't apprehend it immediately. Mm-hmm. It excludes judgments that human beings have inherent worth or intrinsic dignity, right? That is compatible with saying that their survival is good, but it doesn't go deep enough. It doesn't explain why we might judge that others have intrinsic dignity, right? And a more fundamental problem is that most of these explanations for the formation of our moral judgments are means end, or it kind of duplicates this utilitarian thinking and this is a very important point. I want to make sure I get it clear. The idea is we need to explain the formation of these moral judgments, and what causes the formation of these moral judgments is the good of survival, the end of survival, right? And so if an action A causally contributes to some object of my evolutionary selected desires, in this case survival, then I should do A, right? And so there's this action. If that action contributes to a particular end that I apprehend as valuable, then I should do the action. And that's kind of duplicating a utilitarian way of thinking about things. But notice I would do that, right? I would do that action that contributes to survival, even if it happens to be the case that I violate somebody's rights, or I torture them, or I murder them, right? And this is the problem with any kind of utilitarian thinking, is that the idea of an intrinsically immoral action drops out.
Yes, right.
Right. So there's no actions are right or good, only parasitic on its conduciveness to a particular end. And to the extent that moral judgments are explained with reference to an end of survival, we still have the utilitarian explanation that leaves out, well, what explains our ability to apprehend the intrinsic quality of certain moral judgments?
Yeah. That is also a very subtle but important point. I just want to ask a few questions and clarify a few points, because it sounds like you're saying, like, look, the general naturalistic evolutionary account actually fails on a much sooner or more fundamental level before we even get to the issues that you're wanting to focus on. And I think that's definitely right. I mean, I was consider myself a naturalist for many years, and the naturalists that I thought made the most sense to me were the anti-realists, right? It just seemed like there's just no real plausible explanation for why we have these moral intuitions or seemings that we have them because they are true. There just seems to be no really plausible account, but we need to have an account of where it's plausible that we have them because they were true, not just because they're conducive for fitness. And like, to me, it doesn't even seem like a matter of probability. It seems like there's just no plausible account at all, right?
Okay,
Once you get into the weeds of it, certainly, I think, you could, I guess, cash it out in terms of probabilities. It just seemed very clear to me that the anti-realist, flavor of naturalist, or the eliminativist flavor for naturalist, was just seeing the predictions of that worldview much more clearly. And I think it's absurd at the end of the day, but they're willing to be more consistent within that framework. I mean, there's many naturalists who argue for this today, right? That argue that adaptive link accounts between fitness and moral beliefs are just inconsistent with science and naturalism, right? That you should be a constructivist. I'm sorry, the adaptive link account is the one you should prefer. You shouldn't think that a tracking account is true, where fitness follows some mind-independent moral truths, right? There's no reason to think that should be the case if you're a naturalist, because there are relevant differences here between our moral experience, where it seems like we can have adaptive behavior, say the behavior I have for me caring about my kids, without any linking up to certain moral truths, right?
Yeah.
Where, I can still think that it's reliable that this McNugget buddy is in front of me from McDonald's, right? Because if it were a lion, right, that makes sense that should be reliable, because there's like, if it wasn't, then I'd probably be in deep trouble. But there's no reason to think that that's a similar situation with our moral experience, right? And this is actually, I just want to pick your brain about this, Dr. Napier. It's like, this is a problem I actually have with certain ethical intuitionists who are themselves naturalists, when they try to deal with objections to ethical intuitionism coming from the evolutionary side. I don't think that they have a good response to that, because the whole idea, for people who are unfamiliar, if you're an ethical intuitionist, you think that we're sort of justified in holding, to a lot of the stuff that Dr. Napier has talked about because of various seemings or intellectual appearances or stuff like that, right?
Just take it for granted the cognitive process that generates those judgments is reliable.
Yeah, and of course, you know, what they'll generally say to skeptics is like, look, anything you're throwing at this account is not relevantly different from anything that you could throw about intellectual appearances or seemings about anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're saying, and what I think is right, is no, there is a relevant difference when it comes to evolution and moral beliefs. And
Mm-hmm.
it's that identification of a relevant difference that I think should really give the ethical intuitionist, who is a naturalist, serious pause. I don't think I've seen good responses from the various intuitionists. And ultimately, I agree with you, Stephen. I think if you're going to be an intuitionist, an ethical intuitionist, or something like that, yeah, you probably do need theism, right? I dumped a lot out there, but go ahead.
No, that's right. And I think Michael Ray's point in his book World Without Design is sorry, I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm responding without kind of clarifying.
That's okay.
So the point you raise is that's correct. Ethical intuitionists typically want to say, look, my moral intuitions are reliable, or at least on par with any other intuition that my interlocutor would grant in other spheres, like mathematical intuitions or
sensory experiences, memory experiences,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. So the idea is that we should just take it for granted because, the intuitions are on par with these others. And Ray's point is that, well, we shouldn't even grant that, right? Because even those intuitions on mathematical truths or logical truths are up for grabs too. We have no reason for thinking, given unguided evolutionary processes, that my cognitive faculties would apprehend necessity, right? And so a priori intuitions would be on the chopping block as well. And so, yeah, to your point again about the mode by which ethical intuitionists argue is they want to argue from analogy, basically, that ethical intuitions are reliable, or at least just as reliable as our a priori ones, right, given naturalism. And Ray wants to insert and say, well, given naturalism, even those intuitions that you're taking as a ground or kind of a staple in the discussion, well, that's up for grabs too.
Right.
So, okay.
Yeah, great point. And I guess I would want to say two things. I think that's definitely right. But I also want to say that even if you were a naturalist, I think you could still give a principled case of why they're not on a par. Right, of why you might be able to,
yeah, that's what you were saying.
Of why you might be able to identify a reason why, say, intuitions about sensory experience would reliably connect with the world beyond us, but not moral intuitions, right? So I think it's a double problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's my second observation. That's a very good. So I was thinking, let's just take a ethical intuition. Torturing somebody is wrong, right? Okay. Now, we don't have, like we do for sensory experiences, you said, right? There might be some sort of causal connection between me correctly sensing that there are no lions in your room and my survival. Okay. Now, I don't think that connection can be grounded in the case of moral judgments. And we can kind of pursue. I mean, it doesn't take too much imagination. So suppose we have a community that thinks that torturing people, let's say even people outside the tribe or family, is wrong, right? Let's even grant that, which I've said is problematic for other reasons. But let's even grant that. Well, that doesn't tell you that you've zeroed in on the deontic quality of that action. Right. So you might think that torturing someone is wrong because it makes people grimace, and grimacing is wrong. Or it makes people writhe, and writhing is wrong. Well, grimacing and writhing aren't really wrong, right? But that's the empirically observable phenomenon, right? That might result from torturing someone. But that doesn't get at the deontic quality of that judgment, the deontic quality of the judgment, is that you ought never to do this because it's a violation of that person's bodily rights.
Right.
Yeah, and that is not explained. That ability to zero in on that aspect of moral reality is not explained by any of these accounts, right? So we can have these judgments that are decoupled from moral reality, right? You can have a judgment that justifies behavior that's good. So the tribe, let's say everyone in the tribe believes that torture is bad. And that belief gets handed on and blah, blah, blah. You still have not accounted for their ability to apprehend the true reason for why it's wrong.
Yes.
Not on naturalistic grounds, not strictly linking up, accepting this causal link between sensory stimulation and adaptive behavior, even granting that. You still cannot say that that explanation trickles down to the moral judgments that are in question here.
Yeah. Great point. Just a few things to add to it. I actually think like once you realize that and all the other issues concerning moral knowledge and with respect to evolution plus naturalism, right? Is again, I think it should have you turn around and become an anti-realist. Because if you were assuming that there was some sort of, say, dependence thesis between moral and natural facts, well, everything we've just said should give you question to question that, should give you reason to question that thesis in the first place.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Yeah,
so I think it can turn back around, right?
You have no reason for thinking that your cognitive abilities would apprehend that aspect of the moral reality, right? And so, well, if you think that and you're consistent, you should say that, well, there is no deontic aspect to our moral judgments. Right?
Yeah. And I also want to, let me know if this is getting too quick ahead, but sometimes a lot of things that come into these, into the worldview debates are the sort of, various theoretical virtues, right? Explanatory comprehensiveness, but simplicity is a big one.
Yeah.
And boy, the anti-realist position seems very simple, very elegant, right?
Yeah.
So like, I think if you're a naturalist, that might just be another, unless you really think that it fails in terms of its explanatory comprehensiveness. But I guess I think that, yeah, it does. But so does any realist naturalistic account as well. But things get really complicated really quick once you start to dive into the weeds of the various naturalistic accounts of these things, or things are sort of just asserted but not well established. So let me pick your brain about this, because one thing, I was just actually reading a book on an ethical intuitionist who is he's not here to defend himself, so I won't throw him out there, but the claim was generally something like this: is like, well, it's not like we have a special moral faculty that we need to have evolved. It's just the application of reason to moral subject matter, right? And so this, intuition wants to say that, okay, if you're going to try and keep pushing the skeptical line from the evolutionary angle, then you're just really attacking reason itself. And I guess one response there is what you already said, is like, okay, people are really, they're happy to do that, right? But it was never really articulated just, what is the name? This is an issue I have with a lot of worldview debates, Stephen, is a lot of them assess like what is reasonable and what is not, without first articulating just what reason is to begin with, right? You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
I mean, so I don't know, maybe I threw something out there, but you can develop it if you want.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things he said there. One is I'm tempted to jump into the anti-realism line, but I'll do that in just a minute. This idea, though, of what you said just recently about it's just reason being applied to moral facts or moral information, right?
Yeah.
But that's puzzling, right? We need to think of cognitive faculties as tuned to different kinds of information.
Yeah.
Right. And so our perceptual faculty is actually divvied up into the 5 different senses. But typically people, what they mean by perceptual faculty is vision specifically. Mm-hmm. But notice our vision capabilities do not dispose us to apprehend electromagnetic fields.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
For example, right? So what is coming into our cognitive system is only information that our cognitive system is able to apprehend and process. Mm-hmm. So this idea of reason being applied to moral information, you still need to suppose that there is this cognitive mechanism that's allowing us or attuning us to that particular kind of information, namely goods and evils, right, or values. And what I'm specifically highlighting is the deontic, the ought, the must aspect of some of those moral actions and the judgments about those actions.
Yeah, and it's not like these things could be reduced to matters of contradiction either.
Spell that out.
I'm just trying to think if somebody wants to really just say, well, no, it's grounded in something else, right? I mean, I think it's wrong to say that it's okay to torture a child for $5, but it doesn't seem strictly contradictory to say it, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, well, that might slide into the anti-realism bit, right?
Yeah.
Why do I think anti-realism is not a promising route? Well, here's where I want my twist. This is what I think we talked backstage about this. I don't think it's a promising route because the principal arguments against theism rely on a fairly robust moral realism. So let's spell that out. So, well, just both arguments, the evidential argument from evil and the argument from divine hiddenness. Both of them rely on a premise to the effect that there are certain things that ought never to be done. Well, I mean, typically atheists characterize or expound or explain the evidential argument from evil with reference to there are gratuitous evils, right? There are evils for which not even God would be justified in allowing, even an omnipotent God who can bring about, right, who can kind of arrange things such that certain compensating goods could accrue to the sufferer. Mm-hmm. But there are certain actions that just seem to be impregnable to such an analysis. There are no possible or known goods that could justify that action, which amounts to what I would call a deontic claim. There are certain actions or events that ought never to be done, and God, in allowing them, ought never to do it. Right? If God did exist, God ought never to permit it.
Right. And since God couldn't do something that he ought never to do, it must mean that he doesn't exist, right?
That's right. Yeah. Right. Now, obviously, right, if God could justify allowing that action, then it's not part of the evidence of evil that would count as against God's existence, right? Mm-hmm. So it has to be something that God ought never to allow, right? But yeah, if we have no reason, given unguided evolutionary mechanisms, to think that our cognitive faculties would be attuned to the deontic quality of certain moral actions, we have no reason for thinking that we would reliably make the very judgments that are figuring in the premises of an argument against God's existence, the evidential argument from evil. The argument for divine hiddenness is that God ought never to withhold a clear expression of his existence to a non-resistant seeker, right? Right. It ought never to be done. So it's the same claim. So again, this ought, right? This must is, if I'm right in what we've said before, that there's no reason, given evolutionary mechanisms, to explain why we would be attuned to that aspect of our moral judgments. We have no reason for thinking, or at least an atheist has no reason for thinking, that the judgments that figure in these arguments against God's existence are reliable at all. No reason for thinking that they're true. And so the anti-realist route would undercut the two principal arguments against God's existence. And if the two principal arguments against God's existence are undercut, right, if there's no reason for thinking that they're plausible, well, there's no reason for resisting belief in God, right? I mean, you might find a problem with the argument from religious experience or the argument from contingency, but that's not an argument to disbelieve. It's not an argument that belief in God is false.
Right. I see. Yes, I see what you're saying. Right.
It's just that particular argument, it doesn't force me to believe.
Okay. Yeah, that actually is clarifying for me, because I wanted to throw a potential objection there, but I think the way you've couched it might dodge this objection, right? Because it's really a matter of operation, right? For a person to feel like God does not, or probably does not, or cannot exist because it just would not be morally acceptable for us to be in this world if God exists, does seem to require an implicit commitment to moral realism. Mm-hmm. And if you give up that commitment, you have just given up those reasons for disbelieving in God. Mm-hmm. The objection that I was thinking of, which is one that I've been writing a little bit about in related to, I actually think I sent you a version of it right before you went on your trip, so you probably didn't get a chance to look at it, was actually something that was coming up from a conversation that we had a while back about a certain inconsistency between rejecting PSR on one hand and pushing the problem of evil on the other hand.
Yeah.
But that objection is something, maybe along these lines of saying, well, hold on, it's not too fast, because really what we're posing here is just an internal critique. It's a problem just from within the framework. So you know what I'm saying. Maybe you want to just speak to that or spell out what the objection is.
Yeah. So the idea here is I'm trying to, like, you want to think of it this way: is the style of argument is let's put ourselves into the worldview of an atheist or an evolutionary naturalist, and then let's accept all those claims, and then let's kind of tease them out. What would I have reason to believe? What should I discard? Right. And what I want to suggest is again, I have no reason for thinking that my cognitive faculties would be reliable in making moral judgments of any deontic quality. And then what I want to suggest is that when I really think about it, when I really think about the evidential argument from evil, I'm going to find that, well, the premise one involves a deontic judgment. Mm-hmm. And if I think that my cognitive faculties are not reliable in making such judgments, then I have no reason for thinking that premise is true. And if I have no reason for thinking that key premise is true, then the argument loses its plausibility. If the argument loses its plausibility, then my reasons against theism or against believing theism are undercut. Not that they're false, it's that they're undercut.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
Right. I have no reason for it, right? Mm-hmm. So you might think of the distinction here, like suppose, and there's a example from John Pollock, I think. He says, suppose you're at an assembly line and you see these widgets coming out, right? And you form the belief that these widgets are red. And you relate this judgment to the foreman who's standing next to you, and the foreman says, those widgets, they're being irradiated by a red incandescent light bulb to highlight imperfections of sorts. And what this does is it makes them look red, even if they weren't. Okay, so what the foreman tells you undercuts your reason for thinking that they're red. Mm-hmm. Now, they might still be red, but your whole and entire reason for thinking that they're red is now no longer valid. It's undercut. It's, what other term can I use? It's ineffective. It's not, right. It's inert. And that's what I want to suggest, is that the evidential argument from evil becomes inert from the perspective of the atheist who's formulating it.
Yes. Could they say, try and move it around and say, well, what about within the framework of theism? Who is committed? The theist presumably is committed to a moral realism. I can't say I've met too many theists that are anti-realists. I guess it's always an odd bird here or there, so I'm not going to say that they don't exist. Does that framework have an internal tension then, where the evidentiary problem of evil would still have force, right? Yeah.
Yes. And then that's and
then you just have to give your standard theodicies at that point, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so when you read, certain theistic philosophy like Eleanor Stump or Richard Swinburne, I mean, they're really kind of grappling with how can we explain suffering in a theistic universe in which we believe that God loves everyone deeply, right? That is a philosophical and existential problem of acute and profound concern for the theist. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's right.
So yeah, no, that's good. I just wanted that to be properly situated. I think that's how should somebody's agnostic then, Dr. Napier, right? They're neither in camp theism or camp naturalism. With everything that's just been said so far, how do you think that the chip should fall, or how should they think through the matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Alan Plantinga has this interesting argument right in the middle of his warranted Christian belief. Very interesting. It didn't get too much attention, unfortunately. But he has us suppose from the perspective of an agnostic.
Oh, I know which one you're talking about. It is interesting. Yeah, he essentially reruns his argument for agnosticism, right?
Yeah. So he says, well, let's say, I am again. Let's put on the beliefs. Let's take on these beliefs and see where they go. Mm-hmm. So let's suppose that I believe that. Well, I don't know the origin of my cognitive faculties. I don't know where they came from. I don't know, what caused them. I have no belief whatsoever about that. He says, well, if I do really believe that, then I have no reason for thinking that they're reliable. Right. And he gives the example of, let's suppose I come across, I'm a space traveler and I land on this planet and I come across this radio. And this radio is spitting out random sounds and English sentences and maybe some other things. But if I don't know what this radio is tuned to or anything, I cannot infer that it is communicating anything of truth, right? Even when it churns out English sentences that I might be able to understand. Mm-hmm. I don't have any reason for thinking that what the speaker says is any indicator of how things are on Earth. Again, if I don't know where it came from, what channel is it tuned to? Like, let's suppose I could update it just a little bit. Let's suppose that some alien comes out of nowhere and lands on Earth without us knowing it and starts to watch TV. And there's reality TV, and then there's more authentic expressions of our artistic acting and stuff. Well, if the alien doesn't know whether this is if this is reality TV, if this is a reality TV show, or if it's something that's fictional, the person cannot, or the alien wouldn't be able to say, this is a reflection of reality, right? Again, if you don't know your origins, there again, you don't know whether your cognitive faculties developed in such a way that they would be reliable.
Right.
So the same conclusion follows if you're agnostic. If you don't know.
Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. I thought that was like a really fascinating. Was it even a footnote? It might have been a footnote or something.
No, it took up like maybe a page and a half.
Yeah, and I was like, wow, I was like, that's really profound. Like, I wish he would have said more about that. And You're right. I haven't seen much more about that. So funny you brought that up, because I had the same impression that you did. Talk to me about this real quick, not to get into issues of a meta epistemology, but people worry about circularity issues with stuff like that, especially like meta level circularity issues. Mm-hmm. I know you know what I'm talking about. Do you think that's an issue? How do you think if you're like an externalist like Plantinga? Should you be bothered by that, or what? Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, since we're taking on different belief systems, I might as well take on my own, right?
Let's do it.
I believe that God exists. I believe that God loves me. God believes everyone loves everyone, and creates us and sustains us for our good. And one of those goods is the formation of true beliefs, not just about our world, but about God, God Himself, and about, in particular, importantly, about what the conditions are for a flourishing life. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I don't find that I'm stuck in these cognitive circles, these epistemic cul-de-sacs.
Yeah.
Because I believe that my faculties are reliable. Maybe they need some refining. You know, we are all susceptible to biases.
Yeah.
And
not infallible. That's right. Yep.
Not infallible, right? Yeah. That's right. We're all susceptible to biases. We grow up in a particular culture. Yeah, I don't think any of these circularity arguments apply. And you mentioned externalism, which is the view that, well, so long as the cognitive faculties are reliable, I can have knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And the moniker externalism is, so long as the external connection between my mind and reality is there, then I have what Linda Zagzebski refers to as cognitive contact with reality. I think that's right. A nice way of describing knowledge.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of where I come from. Now somebody might say, well, why do you believe in God? I mean, it's, why do I believe that there's trees outside? I mean, it's very, I haven't had a glowing Pauline experience of any sort like that. But I do as the church recommends. And, you know, for those who participate in the sacramental life of the church and engage in certain spiritual disciplines, God's there. Mm-hmm. There's a line that I tell my students in my philosophy of religion class from 1 John 4:12. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us and His love is perfected in us. And I think that's a nice description of most theists' religious experiences, right? When we really live with abandon and try to love others, there's something there. There's a quality of that action that really kind of communicates the reality of God.
Yeah, I mean, to that I would say amen. Like there's a resonance, right? There's a mm-hmm. resonance. It's not like you. I never had some profound mystical experience. I think I did get close one time, the first time I was sort of pulled to mass, but for the most part, it's just exactly what you're talking about. The sort of basic resonance in the religious life that I think fits well with Plantinga's general outlook, even if there might be a few ways I would want to tweak it here and there, right? So one last thing I want to talk to you about on this subject, Dr. Napier, is what we were, and this will be kind of another hard gear shift. People will just have to excuse us. Was what we were talking about before, and this is simplicity in worldview comparison.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I was complaining to you. I'm not that much of a complainer, but I was complaining to you that I just think naturalists are a little too quick on trying to score points on having a simpler theory. My listeners have heard my spiel about this numerous times, but you started to expand upon some of your own. So I wanted just to give you space to maybe issue some of your thoughts on that part of the debate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned was that atheists might think that they have the simpler theory, and it might be simple only in respect to there's fewer ontological entities in their closet, their ontological closet. But it's not simple in the following respects. So when you look at the different things that populate our human experience, like our ability to make moral judgments, the design in the universe, the nature of existence. We're contingent, right? There has to be something that explains why, why something is. Something can't come from nothing. And when you look at the panoply of, I just mentioned 3, there's quite a few others, all those are best explained by one thing. And so in that sense, the theistic hypothesis seems to be simpler, right? I'm able to explain the reliability of my moral faculties with reference to a God who desires that I know what constitutes a truly flourishing life. So I'm going to be disposed to apprehend goods that are truly good. That explains that. I also live in an environment that's conducive to survival, right? God explains that, right? Ultimately, God explains some of the more deeper aspects of metaphysics. Why is there something rather than nothing? For the naturalistic worldview, most of these things bottom out at brute facts. Like each and every one of them is just there. It's part of the furniture of the universe. And that doesn't strike me as simple. It doesn't strike me as not simple. It just strikes me as not an explanation at all.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
So, at least with the theistic explanation, because it's a personal one, right? I'm explaining certain things with respect to the desires of an agent who exercises action and intentions.
Yeah.
Agent capital A. So I'm able to explain why certain things are in the same way that we might explain why certain things in my life are because I've acted in such a way. I buy a car, right? I'm able to explain that with reference to the actions of a person, right? And so, yeah, I think that is one way to see it. I see the theistic explanation as truly an explanation. And it's also simple in the sense that the same explanation is able to account for a disparate number of facts about human experience.
Yes. Yeah. And that's really well stated. A friend of mine, Josh Rasmussen, who's been on the show before,
Very good. Yeah.
He likes to say it like this. He's like, I just don't think it's controversial minimally to say that theism is clearly the worldview that explains the most with the least. And in that sense,
that's a good way to say it too.
And that just seems absolutely right to me. And when I examine naturalism carefully, which I've always tried to do, even back when I was a naturalist, it seems like you just don't really get an adequate explanation. It seems like you do kind of got to park out and brute facts. And I've been clear that I think if theism has to park in a brute fact as well, that's a huge cost. But I don't think that's the case. And this is why I think classical theism is correct, because to my mind, if you're going to get ultimate explanation, you have to transcend. You have to have something that is so relevantly different than all those sorts of things that are clearly not, nor could never be self-explanatory. Composite things, changing things, finite things. And it seems the only thing that could possibly not be any of that is the transcendent notion of classical theism. This absolutely simple, infinite, perfect. The idea being, if you can't have something that is self-explained, then nothing is explained at the end of the day. And the only sort of thing that could be self-explained to me is that entity that various philosophers have groped out through various traditions that is the God of classical theism. But then, of course, I think you get simplicity advantages is too, because as many different philosophers have argued, it seems like, well, first there's philosophers argue simplicity just doesn't matter at all, right? It's like, it's maybe relevant in sciences, but when it comes to philosophical application, it's just not legitimate, right? I'm not that skeptical. But there are philosophers who really think that the simplicity thing is overblown, even in science, but definitely in philosophy. But putting that aside, it seems like it probably matters most at the fundamental level. And if you have something that can unify a bunch of disparate things above, that, especially, and give a deeper explanation of those things, that seems to me like a definite increase in simplicity. Whereas if you lop off God as that very deep explanation, you might have one less thing floating around in your ontology, but now you have a bunch of disparate things at the bottom, disconnected brute facts. So it seems like that's actually far more complicated in the most relevant respects. But I want to go further than that. It's like, it's not like it's even, you can even make these apples to apples comparisons, because the more I've thought about it, it's like, how you think about fundamental reality fundamentally affects how you think about everything else. Like if you're a theist, like, is any reality mind independent ultimately? Right? It's probably not, at least from the perspective of God's mind, right? But if you're a naturalist, and you have presumably mind dependent and mind independent reality, so now you sort of have more categories that maybe the theist might be able. I'm just kind of speculating here, but also if you're a naturalist, you know, for the theist, I think you could say there's no ungrounded, contingent, or necessary things, right? But for the naturalist, you are going to have necessary things or contingent things that seem to need to be grounded but aren't, and that's another cat, because now you have grounded contingent things and ungrounded contingent things. The theist can definitely avoid the latter. I want to be careful about necessary things, because thinking about necessary things and truths is a little bit more complicated, but definitely with like contingent things, right? So the point I'm making is not meant to be decisive. It's just that whatever you're thinking about on the fundamental level vastly shapes and reframes sort of everything above it. I'd love for you just to give your thoughts on any of that, right?
Yeah, no, this is great. So one of my thoughts that you mentioned that, you know, there has to be a transcendent explanation for reality. And I immediately thought Eric Reitan has a very interesting analogy to illustrate why, in his discussion of the contingency argument. He's kind of exploiting sort of a similar thought experiment given by Leibniz. But imagine you're kind of at the middle and you're watching this train, right? This long train. Let's say that this train is infinitely long, suppose, right? And it starts to move, right? Well, cars don't move themselves, right? So this car would kind of pull the next car, and you can kind of see why the cars are moving, but you do know that the cars don't move themselves, right? So analogous to contingent things, they don't move, come into existence, or stay in existence themselves. It's not as if contingent things lose their contingency once they come into existence.
Right.
So contingent existence seems to be dependent upon the movement of something else, right? So even if this train is infinitely long, you still have to suppose that there's a locomotive, something that can explain its movement with reference to itself.
Yeah.
Right. And so analogously, right, contingency can't explain itself, right? It can't explain why it exists. Only reference to something that has its existence in itself can explain the existence of other things. So I thought that was a helpful analogy. Reitan is quick to note that's just an analogy.
Right. And of course, it's gonna.
And Rasmussen is really good on this too. You know, kind of canvassing, you know, some of the other assumptions and the argument that can kind of put some clothes on that analogy. But that's what I thought of there. I said a couple points I forgot now.
I'm trying to remember them myself. You sorry. Once I get going.
That's right.
As my wife will tell me, it's hard to get me to stop. What was it that I said? Oh, of how, depending on what you think is at the bottom, it often drastically affects how you think of everything above it in relation, right? Of whether you have grounded contingent things or ungrounded contingent things and stuff like that. And depending on how all that gets sort of carved up will greatly factor into just how complicated your theory actually is, right? So it's just not so like quick and easy or cut and dry as I think a lot of people like want to make it seem. Like, oh, you're a theist, you got one more thing. You're more complicated. Occam's razor, right? That's like, but even like, you know, so I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that. Right?
No, that's well, Swinburne, I vaguely recall Swinburne has some comments on this idea of simplicity and theism that are very relevant. I just can't recall them to mind now, but I think it's in his Existence of God, which is now in a 3rd edition.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's, and he's usually good on those issues. But I forgot what he said, so I'll stay quiet.
That's all right. You've certainly given us plenty of really good stuff. So, sorry, we've gotten a little far from the original topic, but if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Napier, maybe just could you give a quick summary of the thrust of your argument, just one more time, and any of the key things you'd want people to take away from it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, I think maybe 2 or 3 key points. I mean, the first key point is that given unguided evolutionary mechanisms, we would have no reason for thinking that we would form cognitive faculties that would apprehend the deontic quality of moral judgments. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, first, because the deontic quality of our moral judgments are this aspect of what one ought never to do, or what one must do, right? And it might be the case that most of the evolutionary explanations for our moral judgments don't explain the ability to see that ought. They might explain that we have the judgment, but not that the judgment must be that case, right? The survival is good. To go back to Michael Ray's example of our knowledge of mathematical truths, it might be the case that some survival advantage confers on someone who knows that 2 + 2 is 4 always, but no further advantage is conferred on those who think that 2 + 2 must be 4, right? Similarly, for certain moral judgments, right? For torture, right? Some survival advantage may accrue to somebody who thinks, or a community that thinks, that torture is wrong, but no further survival advantage confers on someone who thinks that it's wrong because it's a violation of the person's rights, or it's the violation of their intrinsic dignity. And again, we have no reason for thinking strictly on naturalism, for thinking that we would apprehend the intrinsic dignity of another person, right? What is that? It's not an empirical phenomenon to begin with. Neither are rights, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, right? So if we have no reason for thinking, given unguided evolutionary mechanisms, that we would apprehend the deontic quality of certain moral judgments, well, then I extended this. We have no reason for thinking that the first premise in the evidential argument from evil is true, right? Mm-hmm. At least from the perspective of the atheist who's putting that forward. Why? Because that first premise requires a judgment to the effect that certain things ought never to be done, or they, not even God would be justified in allowing. But again, if we don't have any reason for thinking that our cognitive faculties would be attuned to the deontic quality of those judgments, we have no reason for thinking that those judgments are true. If we have no reason for thinking that they're true, the argument is undercut. And I explained the idea of being undercut, that is, there is no reason for it. Okay, it might still be true, right? But one loses a reason for thinking that it's true, in the same way that a person loses a reason for thinking that the widgets are red, mm-hmm. once he is informed that they're irradiated by red incandescent light bulbs, such that they would look red even if they weren't. So that's it. I think that's a summary of the key points I wanted.
That was an excellent summary. It has been a fantastic and very spirited conversation, as it always is. I love chatting with you about this stuff, Dr. Napier. Before we close this one out, I just want to make sure that people are aware of your other work. You've got a number of books out, and you've written a lot of stuff. So please tell us a little bit about that, where people can find you and your work. And I don't know, maybe you want to recommend a specific work of yours that relates somewhat to this topic as well. Please go for it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for giving this sales pitch, right?
Yeah, of course. That's what we're here for at the end of the day. It's all winding up for the plug, right?
It's great to talk to you too. So I'm a professor at Villanova University in the philosophy department. I think there's a link to my website if you just go to Villanova's, my website on Villanova's philosophy department. There's a link to my personal website. I have 2 books out now. One's entitled Uncertain Bioethics, which is available for free. You can get it online. It's published by Routledge. And my first book is Virtue Epistemology, which is not for free. But it's, in my opinion, it's not as exciting as the Uncertain Bioethics. Some of the issues that we discussed today, I think, are on a previous podcast. I haven't published anything on this yet. It's kind of part of a longer book project. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think I'd refer to your readers or hearers to the previous podcast that we did on naturalism. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah, thanks for the time. It's always great to talk to you. You're really sharp on these things, and you have a book out too, right? Or coming out?
Yes, and I've plugged that enough on my podcast. But for the listeners who want the update, because you're going to be getting it as we get closer and closer. The book with Sophia is I'm editing it right now, so it's back in my hands. I have to finish that up by the end of this month, so that's always painful. But we're on target, and then they want to have it out by spring. And of course, it's all about the worldview comparison stuff that we're talking about here. So in fact, this is how it always goes, right? You finish a draft, then you talk to Stephen Napier, and he's got this cool argument you never considered, and you're like, can I squeeze this in here? So I'll have to give you at least a footnote or something about this. Hey, there's this other thing, right?
That's great.
So for listeners, please do check out Dr. Napier's work. I'll link it in the show notes. If you like what we're doing here, please comment, please subscribe. We'll catch you guys on the next episode.